I've reached the point where I felt like it's really important to do something beyond my own opinion, my own experiences, and the experience of others as I dive into the topic of grief more deeply. So today I did a little research on, in particular, the association between anger and grief, which is something that I was encouraged to do by some of the feedback on one of my dailies. And I think there's this really powerful correlation between the two. And anger can be grief masked uh, and misunderstood. Uh, but before I spend a lot of time really diving into that, I want to share kind of a almost an anecdotal occurrence that happened as a result of trying to do more actual research. I stumbled across an interview with a guy named David Kessler, who was interviewed by Brené Brown. And David Kessler co-authored the book on grief and grieving with Mary Kubler-Ross a number of years back, really a highly regarded and widely acclaimed book. She passed away. He's recently authored on his own a book called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief, because the traditional five stages of grief that were talked about historically end with acceptance. And his premise is, yeah, but that's not an end. That's not enough. Acceptance alone isn't an adequate conclusion to grief. And the truth is, there is no real conclusion. It's an ongoing process. But his point was, acceptance is just so unfulfilling, and that he believes that meaning is the real significance in that sixth step after acceptance. So acceptance means you can get on with your life, but then finding the upside, finding the silver lining in that grief experience that was so devastating and so painful and so difficult to find meaning, to find anything beautiful in the midst of it, is to look for the meaning. And of course, I believe it was Shay that challenged me to explore that conversation further, to really look at, we are grieving, we are in such great pain because that which was lost had such meaning in our lives, and in that is beauty. And man, that's just powerful. David Kessler knows a little bit about grief. He received what he calls the worst phone call a parent can ever make, that his eldest son was killed. And late teens, early 20s, I don't remember his age, but tragic by any definition. So he speaks with some authority on the subject of grief. He talked about also our interdependence when we grieve. And it's one of the ways we find meaning, when we lean on each other while going through the process of grief. And this is also another topic I want to explore in greater detail. And I will also say this, it's really hard to adjust your glasses when you're looking at a camera on a screen and not just naturally reaching up and adjusting your glasses. You do stupid stuff like put your finger in the middle of it instead of on the frame. That really isn't related to grief, but it is related to trying to look like you're comfortable on camera when you're doing stupid stuff like misadjusting your glasses. However, back to grief. David made some brilliant observations. One of the first ones is that grief must be witnessed. And I think the point there is that in order for us to truly experience grief, there has to be an awareness by others or other of our process of grieving. And in order for us to have healing and meaning, that witness isn't just there to observe us in our grieving, they're there to serve a purpose. He talked about the parable of the long spoons. And this is one I'd never heard before, but I found it fascinating. And briefly paraphrased, it's about this old sage who goes before God to ask about the nature of heaven and the nature of hell, and what are they like and why are they in existence and what's the difference. And in this parable, God takes the sage to door number one, which is hell, and they go through the door, and there's this big, massive banquet table, a big round table, with, surrounded by people who were faces were drawn, they were emaciated, they were unhappy, they were defeated, discouraged, depressed, and yet in the middle of this big round banquet table was this massive vat of stew, this great smelling concoction of some porridge or stew. And then surrounding all these people at this massive table were these really long spoons. But the spoons were so long that when someone went to dip into the vat to serve themselves, they couldn't, because the spoons were too long and they were unable to feed themselves. And they were starving. They were defeated and they were depressed. And this was hell. And then God takes the old sage from that room and goes to an identical door and opens a door to a virtually identical room. It's the same table and it's the same people, same number of people, but around that table, these people are all well fed, clear skinned, contented, and happy, even. And there were still the long spoons. But the difference between heaven and hell in this old parable was that in the second room, they were taking the long spoons and they were feeding each other. And I thought it was a brilliant parable about our need for one another in the process of grief and how we can find meaning in grief, not just in the life that we lost or the thing that we lost, the thing that we're grieving, but also in the way humanity can come around us and dip that long spoon in the vat of porridge and bring it to our mouth so that we can eat, so that we can be nourished, so that we can be fed by another. And it's so that in my life, when I become aware, when I am able to witness someone else's grief, I can draw the long spoon and I can fill up a ladle full of food and offer it to my friend, my neighbor, my brother or sister. That point was incredibly powerful. The idea being that we have a responsibility as humans to serve one another, to help one another, especially in these um, difficult, tragic times of grief. Part of what happens in the grieving process in this interview and in this conversation was this notion that we want to bypass the pain by finding the meaning too quickly. So we want to kind of skip over steps so that we can get to meaning, we can get to this woo-woo moment or this aha moment, and somehow it will solve the ache in our heart, and that's just never going to happen. You have to grieve first and recognize that the meaning um, is not found in the loss or the death or what transpired. The meaning is found in what we do next. The meaning is found in us. And I can think of so many examples that have been shared with me right here in this workshop that profoundly illustrate that. So my intent and my daily today is about that recognition, the connection between anger and grief, and anger coming from the fact that we really can't find meaning, and then why we sometimes try to jump ahead to find meaning before we've actually gone through the process of grief. And then the reality of where meaning comes from, and it's this interdependency we have on one another, how we can really bring value to one another by drawing that long spoon and helping someone walk through the road of grief by being, if nothing else, an available ear to hear or a shoulder to cry on or a hug or whatever. And ultimately recognize that the meaning does not come through that loss or that life that was lost, but it comes through us and who we are as a result of that thing that we experienced. So this is my daily today. I chose to do video because I'm trying to experiment with different media so that I can be more competent. And Zoom cooperated today. So there you have it. I'd love your feedback and your thoughts. And sorry for the long rambling.